Good morning, Professor. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Of course, syempre, ang unang tanong dyan ano po sa tingin nyo itong sinabi po ni US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin sa kanyang statement about invoking the Mutual Defense Treaty? And do you think ito pong US is kind of backpedaling about it? Dahil base po dun sa naging sagot niya during the dialogue in Shangri-La, in Singapore rather.
Oo, napanood ko yung speech ni Secretary Lloyd Austin.
Yes.
Malinaw naman doon that he continues, and has been the position of the United States na ironclad yung commitment ng United States sa defense of the Philippines in case the Philippines wants to invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty. Kaya lang kasi, similar to the speech of President Marcos, basically, no one wants war and outright conflict. No? Wala yan sa interes ng kahit sinong bansa. And therefore, what is important is that the Philippines and the US, together with other allies, build credible deterrence so that the use of force will not become a scenario. Kaya yung sinasabi ng ng Chinese Defense Minister, no, in the Shangri-La dialogue, that what the Philippines is doing is creating or forcing scenarios. Medyo ang sinasabi nila that if they're accusing the Philippines that tayo yung gustong magsimula ng gulo. But hindi rational yon, no? There is no rationality behind that because first and foremost, malaki yung power asymmetry between China and Philippines. Why would we dare start conflict?
Or provoke.
Yes, so ang importante sa atin is that and President Marcos said that the Philippines has peace, and we, in our constitution, we denounce the outright use of military force as an instrument of foreign policy. However, that doesn't prevent us from building our defense systems, building credible deterrence, so that if worst comes to worst, we're prepared to defend our national security.
Yes, Prof, I'd like to touch a little on yung Mutual Defense Treaty natin. No? Of course, ang sinasabi nila is for it to be activated, we have to invoke it. But what constitutes an act of war on the Philippines for the US to respond? Kasi very vague ang pag-determine kung ano yung act of war. When Secretary Lloyd Austin says, di ba, as much as possible, we will avoid it. So what is the act of war that needs to happen for the treaty to be invoked?
Right. Remember, the treaty was signed in 1951. Back then, iba yung mundo. Iba rin ang notion of warfare. No? Back then, it was still the conventional interstate warfare, meaning state to state. And conventional warfare means that both countries, yung warring parties, will have to declare war. Sa atin kasi, medyo mahirapan tayo because not only do we denounce force, but if push comes to shove, the power to declare war rests not on the executive but on Congress. On the other hand, if we're going to invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty, that means the country is under threat. But you're correct, no? Nagbabago yung interpretation kasi nga noong 1951 there was this, when this treaty was signed, the interpretation was that it's an attack on the homeland, no? Meaning yung mismong mainland natin, no? But we're an archipelago, no? Ano ba yung mainland sa Pilipinas?
Yeah.
And nag-evolve na yon to the point that there are now pronouncements, very recent over the years, that this constitutes any part of the territory and perhaps any part of even maritime zone of which the Philippines has sovereignty and sovereign rights with, no? Yung pag-expand na yon, it's a product of the changing context, no, of the Philippines, and it's changing strategic scenario. But dun sa question mo na what will invoke it, that will really depend on both parties. The US and the Philippines has to agree. If the Philippines wants to invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty and the US does not, then nothing will happen. And vice versa, no? If the US
Okay.
Kasi mutual defense yun eh. So if the US is attacked also, part of the Mutual Defense Treaty is that tayo naman yung tutulong, no, sa United States. It's not a one-way street.
Okay.
Right, right. And sabi niyo nga po, napanood niyo rin yung speech during his speech in Singapore. One of the takeaways po doon ay yung kanyang pagsabi about the US and China should manage their rivalry in a responsible way. What do you make of that?
Right. I think yun yung gustong maging role, no, ng Pilipinas and under President Marcos.
Yeah.
No, he mentioned that ang problema po kasi pag nag-away po itong US and China, sabi nga nung isang African proverb, if elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. No?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, tayo po yun, no? Together with all other non-superpower countries in the region. So, it is not in the interest of both US and China to be in conflict with one another, pero mas matindi yung magiging losses sa atin because we're small and middle-sized country. So therefore, I think trabaho ng Pilipinas together with other countries to remind the US and China that our part of the world is not merely a theater of conflict, no? At hindi dapat tayo gamitin na pawns, no, in their larger game. So this is, I think, Marcos's speech is a call for sobriety to let cooler heads prevail, be more rational rather than emotional, because if you will look at the history of warfare, irrational yung nagiging basis ng gera eh. And it could be a slippery slope, no? All it takes sometimes is an accident or an unintentional act, and magugulat na lang tayo that there's already conflict and war on our side of the world.
Yeah, I'd like to touch up on that about yung messaging, like yung sinasabi mo, irrational minds can cause war. But I think, what's your take, no? President Marcos has been very firm all throughout since he was president about how we would protect our nation if need be. But also, ang sinasabi nila, hindi tugma ang pagka-firmness ni President Marcos at the way we behave physically. Because we are shying away from being, not saying aggressive, but at least to defend ourselves. Like for example, Vietnam is very aggressive in the way they defend themselves. And at the same time, when it comes to China bullying Vietnam, they also respond in a way that is expected of somebody who is being bullied. So what's your take on that?
Magkaiba kasi yung konteksto, no, ng Vietnam-China relations at Philippines-China relations. We don't actually have a record of going to war with one another, unlike Vietnam and China. So, and in fact, in the war between Vietnam and China, Vietnam won. No? It's the only Asian country that won wars with the U.S. Against the U.S. and China. So therefore, Vietnam's strategic behavior might not be totally comparable to our own context. On the other hand, China has been a big neighbor of us for decades, even pre-colonial times. And the US colonized us. It's a colonial power, so of which we have a mutual defense treaty. But I agree, no? I think what is important is that the Philippines finds the right balance of not being provocative, but at the same time, no, being able to stand its ground. The previous policy of being accommodationist, being defeatist, giving China everything it wants, obviously did not work for us. Kasi binigay na natin sa lahat, sa China, nagpikit mata na tayo sa ginagawang harassment, sa mga fishermen natin at Coast Guard, naging mabuting neighbor tayo, and yet, during the previous administration from 2016 to 2022, China's aggressive and bullying behavior has not changed. So, ano pang kailangan nating gawin? Maging vassal state na lang? Parang ganun ba? That's yung defeatist policy na yun obviously does not work. And I think the Marcos Jr. administration, sabi nila, well, if we gave everything to China already, it doesn't work. Maybe if we stand up, maybe China will respect strength, will respect being able to say na, teka muna, mukhang umaabuso na kayo. Pero, let diplomacy continues. Hindi naman ibig sabihin na we won't talk to them, we won't communicate to them. But we have to stand when our interests are being undermined. We have to stand up.
Ayun nga lang kasi po ang Chinese narrative would always be, sabi nila, only stakeholders ang dapat nakikialam sa issues na to and they don't like other entities, 'di ba, doon sa issue na yun. But moving forward po, gusto ko lang din po kunin ang inyong thoughts on Marcos extending help to Ukraine, especially kasi syempre yung previous administration, which is the Duterte administration, lean more towards Russia.
Right. Yeah, in fact, I think that was the main rationale kung bakit pumunta si Zelensky dito. And if you notice, it was really abrupt and sudden kasi they could have met on the sidelines of Shangri-La
Yes.
dialogue. Kaya lang umuwi na si PBBM, and Zelensky in fact was a late addition, no, to the lineup of speakers in the Shangri-La dialogue. But I think I think the Marcos Jr. administration is correct in being able to diplomatically receive and even commit to peace. Kasi yun yung gusto natin eh. No? We don't want war on any part of the world because unlike other countries, 10% of our population are overseas. Kahit saan magkaroon ng gera around the world, apektado
Nandun ang
tayo
Pilipinas.
given we have Filipinos. And finally, we cannot really ask for help from other countries to help us preserve peace and stability if we don't help other countries. At the moment, Ukraine needs help, so therefore we should help them. Kasi kung puro tayo, o tulungan nyo kami kasi may problema kami in terms of peace and stability, pero hindi tayo tumutulong sa ibang bansa,
Right.
then sinong tutulong sa atin, di ba?
Exactly.
That's right, that's right. Well, with that, thank you for joining us, Professor Aries Arugay, Chairperson of UP Diliman's Department of Political Science.